Okay.
Hi, Dina.
Brilliant.
Hi, Silka.
Hi. Hi, Liz.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Should we be on mute when we're not talking? Yeah.
Yes, Liz. Yes, that would be great. So if we're currently live, we're just going to give it another couple of minutes, just to allow others to join in from the green room. So if you've just joined us, welcome. So we're just giving it one more minute before we get started. So just bear with us. Thank you. Right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gender and Development Network's webinar, 25 years on, realising the Beijing Declaration's unfulfilled promise on macroeconomic policy. My name is Sophia Fange, and I am the policy manager here at Gaddon, and I will be your moderator today. So I hope you can all hear us. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please put any questions in the chat box. My colleague Samantha will be dealing with those accordingly. And just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. To kick things off, why are we here today? So as many of you will already know, 2020 is a big year for many of us who are working on women's rights issues, as it is obviously the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, arguably the most comprehensive global agenda on women's rights that we have. So in the next hour and a half or so, our three brilliant speakers, who you can already see live on stage, will provide you with insights about the macroeconomic policy agenda that's outlined within the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and what still needs to be addressed in order to realise the ambitions it set out. So although we know that macroeconomic policy was a core part of the negotiations in 1995, its role in delivering women's rights has largely been sidelined over the last 25 years, despite it being really a central component in resourcing rights in 1995. We will also be discussing today what opportunities might be available. Oh, sorry, is there no sound? Can people not hear?
Can you just read out the chat that says from Nikki Vanderkaart? Just clicked on the box.
Yeah, just clicked on the box that came up in the middle of the screen and no sound. And now sound works, so perhaps useful for others as well. So thank you very much, Nikki. So if you are having any problems hearing us, just click on the box in the middle of the screen that says sound now, and hopefully you'll be able to hear what we've been saying, but it has all been recorded as well. So just going back again to the introduction, what this webinar will hope to discuss as well is the opportunities that might be available for civil society organizations as part of the formal review process for the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, really to try and reprioritise macroeconomic policy. So we'll be looking at and discussing the CSW that's coming up in March, the Generation Equality Forum in May and July, and the UN General Assembly in September as well. So in terms of today's agendas, we will be first hearing from our three great speakers. So we've got Dina Musindawezo from Womankind Worldwide, based in Nairobi. We've got Liz Nelson from Tax Justice Network, based in Oxford, UK, and Silke Stark from UN Women, based in New York. So they'll each have approximately 12 minutes to make their interventions, after which time there will be a chance for all of you to pose your questions to them. So please do make sure to use the chat function to send us your questions. As I mentioned at the start, we will also be recording the webinar so that you can later post it on the Gadden, so that it can be later posted on the Gadden website for those of you who weren't able to make it today, and if anybody else wishes to rewatch it at a later point. And lastly, just before I do introduce our speakers, just a shameless plug for Gadden's latest briefing, which many of you might have already read, which is Macroeconomic Policy and the Beijing +25 process, which is currently available on our website. It does touch on many of the issues that the speakers will be addressing today, but we will also send you out a link to the publication at the end of this webinar. So be on the lookout for that. So let's kick off. Our first speaker is Dina Musundarwezo, Director of Policy and Communications at Womankind Worldwide. So what Dina will be doing is providing some preliminary background information about what the Beijing Platform for Action is, how it's structured, and broadly what it has to say about macroeconomic policy, and really also to help us understand what women's rights organizations are calling for on macroeconomic policy. So over to you, Dina, 12 minutes. Thank you.
Declaration Platform for Action in terms of how it is laid out, and I'll give a brief overview around the issues around the macroeconomic policies that are contained in this platform for action. And so the Beijing Platform for Action, as you might know, it's a very comprehensive blueprint that promotes women's rights and gender equality. One of really comprehensive and progressive framework that we have seen in our time, although not legally binding, it affirms so many women's rights legal instruments, such as the Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and all other declarations that came before the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And so the way it is laid out, it has a section that is a declaration, but it also has another section that just looks at the platform, which we call Platform for Action. Under the Platform for Action, there are 12 areas of concern that have been outlined that are extremely relevant for all of us in the area of work that we do in advancing women's rights. And so when you look at the declaration, if I could start from there, it is really comprehensive also on issues specific to macroeconomic policies or economic policies. And that is in recognition that economic policies or macroeconomic policies are extremely key or an enabler to advancing women's rights. And so it recognizes issues such as, first of all, in the preamble, it reaffirms the right to development as a right that has to be protected for all women and all girls. But it also recognizes that there has to be full participation of women in all spheres of society, including in decision-making around economic policies that have oftentimes a disproportionate impact on their lives. It talks about issues around employment of women and equal opportunities for women. And actually talks about equal rights, opportunities, and access to resources, and equal sharing of responsibilities in the family and outside. So these are issues around unpaid care work. But it also talks about and promotes women's economic independence, including eradicating of the persistent and increasing burden of poverty on women, and the need to address the structural causes of poverty. And if we go to the Platform for Action and specific areas of concern, I think the most relevant ones are two. One is an area of concern around women and poverty. And the second one is on women and economy. So if I start with women and poverty, I think what is really, really interesting about this area is that it recognizes women as not just those that are affected by poverty disproportionately, but they actually play a very important role in combating poverty and addressing it. And so it looks at women not as victims that are affected by poverty, but as actors that can combat poverty. But it also looks at women as actors and as beneficiaries of the economy. And I think that is very important, because oftentimes in this narrative, when we hear about women and within the economy, I think what we hear mostly is women are suffering, they are victims of this and that, they lack services, they lack empowerment, and we should empower them. But actually, a Beijing Platform for Action recognize that women are actors, as opposed to simply being the actors in the economy, but also they should benefit equally from the economy. And I think that is very important to acknowledge. It also, within this women and poverty, it talks about the importance of looking at the gender perspective when we look at strategies to eradicate poverty, that it is extremely, almost impossible to achieve eradication of poverty if you don't ensure that you look at the gendered impact of poverty and making that analysis. And again, it talks about the importance of looking at the macroeconomic policies and development strategies that address the needs and efforts of women that disproportionately are affected by poverty. It talks about rural women as those women that disproportionately affected by poverty, migrant women, and all that. It talks about, still under this, under women and poverty, the importance of creating social security systems where they do not exist, that is actually universal and that can be benefited by women and girls. And under women and economy, if I can go to that section, again, it starts by talking about the need for full and effective participation of women in economic policies, including in formulation of financial policies, monetary policies, commercial and other economic policies, as well as tax system and the rules that govern distribution of resources. It talks about the need to address the gender discrimination in key services and opportunities, such as in education, in training, in hiring, remuneration, promotion, and in morbid practices, as well as flexible working conditions. But also it talks about the need to address issues around access to reproductive resources and sharing of family responsibilities. Again, this is something that comes up again under this section. And sharing of family responsibilities, it is services, it is issues such as childcare and stuff like that. It talks about unpaid care work and domestic work for those in paid work, and it actually recognizes that much as at the time there had been an increase in women in increased employment, paid employment, there hadn't been any strategies to address who is going to take care of domestic and unpaid care work. And actually stating that lack of those strategies means that then we increase the burden of work for women. So because then they are participating in labor market, but also they are continuing to do the work, that unpaid and domestic work, most disproportionately. That's something that was talked about 25 years ago, because we were celebrating 25 years of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. But that's something that up to now we see almost lack of progress in that area. That yes, we celebrate women increasing in the labor market, in the paid employment, but actually we haven't thought about who then does the work that they traditionally did of unpaid and domestic work, and therefore increasing the burden of women, which means that we are not really improving the well-being or development of women in essence. Yeah, so but it also recognizes that even when women are entering into labor market, of course, they face a lot of challenges around sexual harassment, around the pay gap, around being in lower positions compared to men, less remunerations, lack of policy that support family work balance. And that's something I think we continue to see even today. And finally, if I can touch on the final thing around financing, also Beijing Platform for Action also talks about issues of financing. I think the first thing it recognizes under financing is the excess expenditure on military expenditure, which takes away from social expenditure, and that has disproportionate impact on women and girls. And I think that's something that we continue to experience even today. But it also talks about the importance of international community making available resources needed for supporting development and specifically for implementing this platform for action. Specifically talks about that developed countries need to be meeting their ODA commitment of 0.7% of their GDP. So that is something that, of course, we see that up to now we are still struggling with that. But I think the final one, is that time up?
No, wrapping up, Dina, too.
Okay, no, that's fine. Actually, I just wanted to make just one last point, which I really like, which says that governments have the primary responsibility to ensure that the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is implemented. They can mobilize resources from others, but they have the crucial responsibility, the primary responsibility of implementing the declaration. I think today we see that responsibility, government wanting to share it with other actors as though almost at equal basis. But I think we need to remind our government that they have the primary responsibility for ensuring that the women's rights are protected and upheld and gender equality is promoted and realized.
Thank you very much, Dina, for helping set the scene and laying out what the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action actually has to say. And also just to say that as part of Womankind Worldwide, which you will also be releasing a report on the whole Beijing Plus 25 review process. And really thank you also for kind of pulling out some of those key asks that women's rights organizations are really pushing for. And that financing question is a really fundamental part of that as part of the review process. And hopefully we'll get a chance also to discuss that in a little bit more detail as we go into the webinar. So brilliant. So next up, we have Liz Nelson, who's the Director of Tax Justice and Human Rights at Tax Justice Network. So what Liz will be doing is providing us a deep dive on what the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action has to say on specific macroeconomic policy concerns. And in Liz's case, obviously being a tax expert, it will be going down that particular avenue. And really also, Liz will be able to provide us some of her insights on how much progress or regression there has been on some of these issues, particularly tax, over the last 25 years. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks to Gender and Development Network for inviting me to contribute to the webinar. I wanted to the first slide, which has a quote from the report from the Secretary General, it has a report that's just been recently released in advance of the UN CSW, and kind of encapsulates for me the real synergy between the Beijing platform and the tax justice framing, which I think is important, which is about the interlocking laws and policies that can strengthen gender equality and the rights of women. I mean, my reading of the Beijing platform is that is the need for these progressive integrated systems and policies, including on tax, which take into account the impact of women. So what I'm going to talk about is a kind of tax justice, what a tax justice framing might bring to strengthen that. Just mention some of the actually the fiscal and political environment of recent decades, which has been about decreasing corporation tax, decreasing or elimination of trade tariffs like trade taxes, continuing debt burdens, and the Beijing platform, as my reading of it, is within that environment, fiscal and political environment of recent decades, makes it a statement very much ahead of its time, and very progressive. So I want to kind of look at what tax justice might do to strengthen that substantive gender equality and how it might complement it. I want to, if we've got time, to just illustrate, mention the issue of financialization, which is, it takes in both tax issues and financial transparency issues, and look at the kind of multiple costs that has on women's rights. And then perhaps we can then talk about kind of our advocacy and what we might do now. So the slide headed tax justice. I just wanted very, very quickly to just be sure that we were clear about what I was talking about when I talked about tax justice. So we're talking about progressive tax regimes, and the other side of that coin is we're talking about financial transparency, as opposed to the secrecy that happens and the profit shifting, and the use of offshore jurisdictions. We could talk about that a little bit later or during the questions. So progressive tax regimes, financial transparency, adequately resourced public-owned regulatory bodies, accountability, like national governments held accountable for raising revenues sufficient to establish and maintain substantive gender equality, and also tax justice is very much about the who. So who are the actors involved, and what's the public role, the private role, and the legal sectors and what they have to do with it. And I think, as Diana said, that governments, and the Beijing platform sets this out, the governments have a legal duty and ratify, kind of underlined through CEDAW, to remove tax provisions that negatively impact those characterized by either like sex, gender, racialization, disabilities, family structure, paid or unpaid work, or other intersectional or multiple forms of discrimination. And many of those categories that I'm just kind of reading out are actually for tax policies uncounted. In other words, they may not be counted in terms of drawn into the thinking about policy. And certainly that is the case at the upper end of the distribution, where the very wealthy people avoid being registered for their wealth, and therefore, it's very difficult to assess how much revenue really is missing, and that's why we often talk about estimates. I also think that the Beijing platform links into the tax justice work because of that integrated statement that about policies and government responsibility, which is very much a part of tax justice framing, which is to remove special benefits that are available to privileged groups, like the very wealthy, and addressing issues of inheritance tax, of taxing households rather than individuals, of looking at, you know, this decrease in and lowering of corporate tax rates, and reversing the elimination of trade tariffs. So the next slide really just kind of is emphasizing some of the main points that I picked out of the Beijing platform, which is around that the institutional mechanisms which you know, both nationally and internationally, that need to focus on tax and financial transparency issues. And I think the Beijing platform for me is quite explicit about taxation. It's much less explicit about financial transparency and what that means. And I think that's perhaps in regard to you know, the last couple of decades, there has been a lot more work that's gone on around analysing and assessing financial transparency. Yeah, so what I wanted to do in the next slide is just called the 4 R's, is just set out some of the important, like, pivotal role that tax can play. Some of them, the first 2, I think, are probably very commonly used and understood, which is about, like, raising revenue, and tax policy can do that, and it can be used to strengthen gender equality by, you know, so, you know, countries progressively can potentially keep corporate tax rates from declining, which they have been doing year after year for actually many decades. If you go back to the 50s, a number of countries had very high corporation taxes. And just quickly to say that there's very little evidence that you know, increasing corporation tax means corporations move out of a particular jurisdiction. There's also an issue around raising revenue for progressively, not to be looking at indirect taxes like consumption taxes, VAT, which a tax that falls hardest on the poor and has been steadily climbing as a kind of international, you know, Bretton Woods kind of policy position. Redistribution is an important role there for governments, as set out in the Beijing platform, for, as it says, public expenditures used to promote basic social education and health needs of women, particularly those living in poverty. And then the 2 others, which are definitely worth mention, that we use within tax justice narrative, as around repricing and the shifting of the cost, using tax to shift the cost of social bads, if I can put it like that, to the worst offenders. So carbon taxing, for instance, is one way. And that recent research, I think that, you know, pervasive, like, gender-based violence is exacerbated by climate change and ecological disasters, you know, because of scarce resources and livelihoods that come under stress as a result of environmental pressures. So redirecting the cost of that away from the public, away from women, putting that tax burden on multinational companies, on fossil fuel industries, shipping, aviation. So it's thinking about repricing in that way. And then finally, that representation is a really often overlooked but really important, because, you know, one of the most important results of tax is its ability for political representation. So, you know, countries that have a prolonged reliance on natural resources or foreign aid, that can undermine channels that governments have to hear voices, have intelligence and knowledge, and to be responsive to women's interests and preferences and rights. The next slide is, I can almost just, I don't really need to read it out, but I'll just say a couple of things, which is just worth saying, you know, thinking about raising revenue and redistributing revenue. and that issue of representation. The scale of tax injustice, the scale of financial secrecy can be drawn from just these three figures. $21 trillion kept offshore in 2012. That's obviously very likely increased. It's an estimate, but it's an estimate of money that is swashing around, that is avoiding regulatory eyes. $500 billion of annual losses from multinational companies, profit shifting through secrecy jurisdictions and low tax jurisdictions. And an example, a regional level. Oh, thanks.
No worries.
A regional level
2
of
minutes.
200 billion profit shifting and leaving the African region. I'll leave this next slide, which is about, because of time, illicit financial flow impacts, because I think some of it's self-explanatory, and if people get those, get these slides as well, as with the secrecy jurisdiction slide. So looking at the care economy and financialization, this is the really important thing about this is that the systems that are of low tax, of financial secrecy, all work together to where there are sectors to create profit, often for a small group of investors. They can burden it with debt. They can put businesses out of business. They can strip assets. And someone actually used this kind of analogy to me. It's like an ATM machine, like a place to extract cash. The consequences for women are extreme and very grave, particularly in the care sector, where there are low incomes, loss of rights, labour rights, loss of provision of public good, women filling the gap for paid and unpaid care. So I've left, there is a resource therefore in the final slide, which has a report about those care financialized issues. I'm conscious I'm running out of time, but the two more slides I'll share with you. One is called the ABCD of transparency, and that sets out four policy areas that we can look at as advocates and activists to create greater financial transparency and cooperation between jurisdictions. The final point I'll make, and I am chopping out some of these points from the slides on our challenges and opportunities. I wanted to really register there's a new joint initiative coming out of the UN to establish a high-level panel on financial accountability, transparency and integrity. I think for us as advocates and on women's rights, it's really important that we watch and monitor how that high-level panel, what its mandate is, and how it integrates substantive gender equality in its work. I think there are a lot of conversations about it at the moment, about its legitimacy, about its mandate, but there's also a kind of a very regressive narrative, which is saying, well, it should look at the issue of corruption. Well, that for me is a very traditional and regressive kind of narrative, which, while corruption is important, some of the biggest losses that impact on gender equality are illicit financial flows and the hemorrhaging of resources from the lowest income countries. So I'll leave it there, Sophie, and apologies I've gone over.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that very detailed analysis as well of the ambition to try and make sure that taxation is at the heart of the Beijing +25 process. And given that it already has reference to it, 25 odd years ago when it was created, I think to try and make sure that it's connecting to some of these bigger global processes that are happening on tax, as you mentioned, the intention to have this high-level panel, I think is a way to make sure that there is coordination across the piece, so that it isn't just a standalone part as part of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action review process, but something bigger and broader and more ambitious to try and connect those dots. So thank you very much, Liz. And so last, but by no means least at all, we have Silke Staub, who's a research specialist at UN Women. Silke even will discuss the potential avenues for advocacy as part of the Beijing +25 review process this year, leading up to UNGA 2020 and beyond. As many of you will know, we've got CSW coming up, the Generation Equality Forums, etc. And many of you will have also seen just this week, actually, that the UN Secretary General has released his report, and we also have a political declaration which is going to be a key part of the CSW process this year, because there won't be agreed conclusions as there is every year. Silke, if you can take us through some of what you think are some of the opportunities that are coming up over the next year, and so over to you.
Can you hear me? Yes? Oh my God, I have a very strange echo of myself when I'm talking. I think I may just turn off my audio because I hear myself with an echo. Yeah? Okay, so thanks so much for having me join this webinar. I'm really pleased to be able to join this, and thanks to the previous presenters for their insights. I work at UN Women's Research and Data section, and we're responsible for the organization's flagship report. Some of you may know the report that comes out regularly, Progress of the World's Women. But another thing that we're responsible for or have been responsible for over the past years are the 5 yearly Beijing reviews. So we did the Beijing +20 review and the Beijing +25 review, which is the Secretary General's report that was already referred to. And so what I wanted to do is, in this brief presentation, is just highlight a little bit how macroeconomic policy issues are reflected in this report. It's a long report, it's a dense report, it has some constraints, etc. But I think I want to stress the report as a first kind of really important tool that can serve for advocacy and can really be harvested in terms of what it says on those issues, trying to kind of come back to what Liz already mentioned, was that very progressive spirit, and in a way visionary spirit of Beijing on some of these issues that holds continued relevance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the report without going much into detail, and then I'm going to talk about the different forums that are going to be happening throughout 2020, and yeah, how you might be able to bring macroeconomic issues into these debates. So on the next slide, just as a general background, so the Secretary General's report this year has 6 main chapters, and they're listed here. The reason for that is, and Dina referred to the 12 critical areas, that 2020 is the first time that progress on Beijing is reviewed in the context of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we really wanted to take the opportunity to show not only how these two frameworks are linked, but also how the Beijing platform really provides very concrete guidance in terms of how to mainstream gender into the different dimensions of sustainable development that are also contained in the 2030 Agenda. So macroeconomic issues, you can see, I'm not going to read them out, the 6 thematic chapters of the report framed by an introduction and a conclusion, with some kind of lessons for moving forward. Macroeconomic issues are covered already and taken up already in the introduction in terms of describing the overall quite disabling environment that we're in. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then are covered in the thematic chapters 1 and 2 mainly on inclusive development, shared prosperity and decent work, the first chapter and the second chapter on poverty eradication, social protection, and social services. But they also come in to the last chapter on the environment, a little bit in the same sense as also was mentioned by previous speakers, that current economic models in the report says that quite explicitly are extractivist and thrive on kind of an extraction of both environmental resources and women's unpaid care work or poorly paid care work. And so that last chapter also kind of is a wink to a feminist Green New Deal and the need for a more regenerative economic model. So on the next slide, I thought I would just give a sense of kind of there's much more in the report, but the overall narrative and the data that we rely on to cover and show macroeconomic issues in the report. It's maybe important to say that the report and each of the chapters draws on two main sources of evidence. So it includes the first part that is really on global and regional trends that draws on data as well as kind of broader independent research. And then every chapter has a second part that draws on mainly on the member states' reports, on the national reports, of which we received 167. And so because this time we sent out a bit of a survey format as well, we were able to quantify some of the areas that governments say they have taken action in under each of these 6 clusters. So in terms of the economy, what the report argues is that current economic models have failed to generate progress and prosperity for all, that economic security and autonomy remain elusive for most women, and linking that also to the burden of unpaid care, we show that this is particularly a problem during childbearing years. So in terms of the data, we show that the gender gap in labor force participation has really stagnated over the past 20 years. It stands at 31 percentage points. In some regions, it has slightly increased. In other regions, in some regions, the gap has slightly decreased, but in other regions, it has actually gone up. Women continue to do most of the unpaid care and domestic work worldwide, 3 times as much as men. And in terms of how that links to poverty, we're drawing on new data that uses extreme poverty and shows that globally and across regions, with all the limitations that this measurement tool has, we're still able to show that, particularly in the age group of 25 and 34, which are prime reproductive years, women are really much, much more likely to live in extreme poverty than men. So they're 25. For every 100 men who live in extreme poverty in this age group, 125 women live in extreme poverty. And we think that's clearly linked to the fact that the burden of reconciling reproductive and productive income earning work falls disproportionately on women. So that's on the next slide. So that's a little bit, I mean, I just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of the kind of data we use and the general narrative. And on this slide, I thought I'd refer a little bit more to that. So another thing that we try to do, and we try to do that already in the introduction, is to really connect the dots between different concerning trends that we see globally and that hold back progress on gender equality and women's rights across economic and political spheres. So the report states that, we see an unequal distribution of development gains, and that has undermined progress across the board. It has led to increasing inequalities, but also spurred social tensions, and is partly responsible for the rise of exclusionary, xenophobic, and misogynistic politics that we see in many countries. So it is, in a way, also connected to the backlash, or the language that the report uses, pushback on women's rights, and the democratic erosions that we see. The report also draws on new calculations by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummins on austerity to show that austerity is really the new normal, and arguing that this has had consistently regressive outcomes for women and girls. And we draw on some of their data to show that by 2021, almost 6 billion people in 130 countries are going to be affected by austerity. And we also show that some of the transmission mechanisms affect women directly in terms of cutbacks on health, pension reforms, and labor market reforms that, where women work disproportionately in the public sector. State retrenchment will also hit them disproportionately. The report also raises concerns, and I think this was also highlighted at the beginning by Dina, particularly in the social services area, over privatization and public-private partnerships, showing some evidence that human rights and decreasing inequalities are not generally the priority of these partnerships and not generally what they perform on best on. And then I thought one interesting point that we were able to extract from the national reports, because we explicitly asked for it, is that we asked countries, has progress on gender equality been affected by austerity measures in your country? 64 countries replied, yes, it has. And then we asked, have you measured the impact on women and men of these measures? And only 9 out of the 64 said they had. And this is, this is self-reporting. So even with that, I think quite telling, and in complete contradiction to what already 25 years ago the Beijing Platform asked for, to measure the impact and assess the impact, the differential impact of macroeconomic policies on women and girls. In terms of the policies, just a very kind of brief snapshot on some of the issues we touch on. We do put great emphasis on gender responsive social protection. That's also something we asked for, and that 70% of states said they had taken measures strengthening social protection for women and girls in order to reduce poverty, among others, including care services and time-saving infrastructure. The report also argues quite strongly, this is in the chapter on poverty, but then also picked up in the forward-looking conclusion, that investments in these areas should really be classified and considered as investments and not consumption, because they foster human capabilities and feedback into economic development. We also discuss the importance of labor market regulations and supporting women's transition from informal to formal work. And in terms of the more classical macroeconomic policies, the report refers to monetary policies, arguing that they should refocus basically on the goals of job creation and also on protecting economies from the recurrent incidents of crises, which we know take a toll on women and girls. And in terms of fiscal policies, a focus on progressive and counter-cyclical fiscal policies to finance investments for gender equality. And there are also, so there's a lot of emphasis on progressive taxation and domestic resource mobilization, but also references, I think, remain to more global taxes like the ones on carbon emissions and financial transactions. So that's, in a nutshell, the report is 100 pages long, so I can't go into everything, but I really encourage you to kind of look through it and harvest it, because there's a lot of stuff that can kind of be taken out and amplified. In terms of what's going to happen next, on the next slide, we have obviously CSW coming up from 9 to 20 March. As was already mentioned by Sophie, there will be a political declaration this year, so no agreed conclusions. The key difference being that the political declaration is not negotiated during CSW, and it's also supposed to be much shorter and much more top level than an agreed conclusions that is usually on a specific theme. So those of you who followed CSW last year was on social protection, public services, and sustainable infrastructure. And so the agreed conclusions really are quite detailed in terms of the specific thematic area. The political declaration will be broad. It is expected to restate member states' commitment to the platform and to the gender responsive implementation of the 2030 agenda. And it is being negotiated as we speak. So the political declaration will already be in place when CSW starts. I thought that would be important to know. So during CSW, the main avenues for advocacy and highlighting things are really the events. And I think one of the more, there are obviously side events and parallel events by civil society, etc. One of the opportunities to intervene in the formal process is to speak during the official events, which are called interactive events, and also the ministerial roundtables. So civil society can, as far as I understand, apply for speaking slots, civil society organizations that are ECOSOC accredited, on some of the different, on the different interactive side events. And there will be one ministerial roundtable that kind of merges the issues of chapters 1 and 2. So that is on the economy, poverty, social protection, and social services. Then there is the string of generation equality forums that are different from the intergovernmental process. They are perceived as a more civil society driven forum that brings together actors, or aims to bring together actors that are actually willing to drive positive change forward. And so there'll be 2 big meetings, one in Paris between 7 and 8 of May, Mexico, and then another in Paris between 7 and 10 July. And these forums are co-organized by a steering group that includes civil society, the governments of Mexico and Paris, and is kind of hosted and facilitated by UN Women. And then finally, there is the official commemoration of the anniversary at the General Assembly in New York in September. And I think it's on the 23rd of September. I have to admit that I'm not entirely sure what is planned for this yet, and I think it may actually not have been decided yet what the exact commemoration will look like. So on the next slide, which I think is the final slide, yes, I just wanted to refer a little bit more to the generation equality forums, and in particular to one of the elements that is part of these forums. So these generation equality forums are conceived of as civil society-centered multi-stakeholder gatherings convened by UN Women and co-hosted by the governments of Mexico and France, which I already mentioned, with the aim of celebrating the power of women's rights activism, catalyzing a new progressive feminist and multilateral agenda. So really to bring supportive states across regions together with civil society and other actors to see how, despite the relative deadlock that we've seen in the intergovernmental sphere, we may be able to make further progress. And the final goal is to catalyze collective action. And one of the mechanisms that is being developed for doing that are these so-called action coalitions. And the themes of these coalitions have now been defined, again, through kind of a process that included different stakeholders, including the civil society advisory group that was formed for the purpose of the Generation Equality Forum. And you can see the 6 themes that have been decided upon on the slide. So gender-based violence, economic justice and rights, bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health and rights, feminist action for climate justice, technology and innovation, and feminist movements and leadership. Each of these action coalitions, and if there is interest, I can also say a bit more in the Q&A about this, but each of these action coalitions is going to be led by a combination of member state, civil society, and private sector, and is thought of developing concrete commitments for the next 5 years that are then also monitored in terms of implementation under each of these themes. What the concrete actions are going to be under each of these themes is still being discussed and will continue to be discussed until Paris. So I understand that these discussions will start at the end of February, continued throughout CSW, and the Mexico Forum, and then the action coalitions with more precise action areas, etc., and mechanisms for monitoring will be launched in Paris. There is a possibility for civil society organizations to apply or express their interest in co-leading some of these action coalitions. As far as I understand, the deadline for that is quite soon, at the end of February. And I think it will be very important to have strong civil society representation in these action coalitions to shape, because it is the leadership of these action coalitions that will shape also the more concrete actions. What actually happens? What are we actually focusing on under economic justice and rights? Are we going to focus on unpaid care and expanding childcare services and social protection? Are we going to focus on financial inclusion, and so on? So that all of that is going to be, I think, subject to debate and good to be involved in. And then later on, these action coalitions will grow in their membership, and others will come on board. But the big contours, as far as I understand, will be defined by this initial leadership group. So I'll stop here. I had my audio turned off, so I hope I didn't go much over time. I didn't hear the ring, if there was one. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Silke. Yes, no, I recognize that your audio was switched off, so you couldn't hear the bell. But no, thank you very much for that very comprehensive explanation about what the processes are that are coming up, and really helpful to also get your insights sitting in UN Women about the opportunities to try and do any influencing within them. And I think it's fascinating as well, the Secretary General report, which is so robust and comprehensive on many of the issues that as women's rights activists and advocates we call on, and especially for those of us who work on macroeconomic policy, to see that so explicitly spelled out in the report is fantastic. And I think it's just a case of now trying to determine whether there is any opportunity to actually make sure that the recommendations within that report are realized and that they come to fruition. And hopefully there'll be a chance to interrogate a little bit of that as we move forward into the Q&A session. So thank you, all three of you, for your contributions and providing us your insights. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A. So for the audience, for the remaining 30 minutes, we will welcome questions from you to our speakers. Perhaps you might have a clarifying question about something that they've already discussed, or perhaps want to raise any new issues which they hadn't had sufficient time to cover. So please make sure to use the chat function, as you've already been using, to send us your questions, which we can then pose over to the speakers. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to start thinking about what those questions are, let them germinate in your mind, and please do start putting those questions in the chat function. And in the meantime, whilst you're thinking of those questions, if I can pose a couple of myself, if I can take the liberty as the moderator to do that, to the panelists. And these two questions I have are to all of you. And so please feel free to answer both, or either or, and just some initial top line reflections from you. So the first question I'll broadly pose to all of you is, so as we've seen from the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, it has a strong analysis on macroeconomic policy, which hasn't been replicated in other global declarations and commitments since. So I pose to you, why do you think it seems that this issue seems to have lost importance over the last 25 years? And what do you think explains this global rollback that we've seen on macroeconomic policy? So just to kind of get your initial top line thoughts on that. And the second question, which feeds off a lot from what Silke was talking about, as it relates to the action coalitions which have now been announced as part of the Generation Equality Forum. So as we know that they've been set up to try and make sure that they deliver on the ambitions of the Platform for Action up until 2025, so beyond the formal review process. And as we know, economic justice and rights is one of those key action coalitions. So I guess the question I have for you is, what do you see as some of the potential risks and opportunities of having private sector actors dictating the terms of delivering women's economic rights and justice, as outlined in the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action? So two broad questions on what explains, in your mind, the global rollback that we've seen on macroeconomic policy over the last 25 years, and what are some of the potential risks and opportunities for having private sector actors involved in the action coalitions dictating the terms for delivering women's economic justice and rights. So I don't know who would like to start off.
I'm happy to start, Sophie.
Sure. Great.
So, so it sounds a bit cynical, but it is. I think with regard to the first question, why has it lost importance? I mean, thinking from a tax justice point of view, and thinking about financial transparency, I don't really think it ever had importance. So I don't think it was a question of losing it. I think there's been a waking up to it, but I think the kind of policy development area around tax has been, I think if there was a kind of sense of fairness, which is obviously part of tax justice, but within that, I think the concept of tax has been seen as a kind of used as a neutral tool, and think if you're kind of use it neutrally, then there'll be bound to be an impact, a positive impact for women, which I think most of us probably on this call know that isn't the case. And I think the other issue about that kind of, as well as the kind of neutrality issue, is that many of the policies around tax haven't been integrated. So kind of thinking about what is the impact of decreasing corporate tax rates and losing trade tariffs? Well, the revenue's got to come from somewhere, and it's just not, in a way, not being thought through in terms of the technical piece. But ultimately, I think those are political decisions. They're not really technical decisions. I just think there's just been a lack of gender analysis in terms of that. At the point about private sector, I think some of the risks around private sector involvement are actually reflected in the fact that there's been a disregard for gender equality in before, during, and since the Beijing Platform, and I think the private sector has to own responsibility for much of that in terms of aggressive tax competition, race to the bottom, etc., etc.
Liz, and Silke and Dina, any initial reflections from you on either or both of those questions? Oh, Dina.
Yeah, okay, you can hear me? Yeah, so on the first one, in terms of why progress is slow in advancing the economic policies that or dimensions that have been captured under the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, I think progress is not slow just on the economic rights of women and economic issues. I think progress is slow generally on advancing and realizing women's rights. If you look at other areas, the evidence is very clear that we are extremely far from where we should be now. And I do think that is because we are working on issue that is extremely systematic and structural, and that we don't have the political will to address and the root causes of the issue that we are facing today. So it's an issue that it is not something that you can address in a few years. It requires a lot of political will, it requires a lot of investments and resourcing, and that has been in many ways lacking from where I sit. But when you look specifically on economic issues, also then you look at the power imbalances between the global north and the global south. I think we know that most of the economic policies are made by just a few people in the global north without the leave alone participation of women, but without participation of even governments from the global south. And I think that in itself means that then they continue to favor those that make those policies and leave out those that have no access. So even the issue around tax justice, we know that the tax policies are not made with like all governments in an equal way from the global north and the global south. We have, as civil society, we have been calling for a tax body under the UN, which would ensure that all member states have equal say. We haven't seen that even being prioritized or even being an option, but of course we keep pushing for that. And so I do think it's because of the structure and systematic nature of the issues that is lacking the political will to address. That is the reason. And we know that the main power holders are benefiting from the status quo as it is, and therefore that slows the progress. On the second question, the generation equality and the involvement of private sector. Let me start from the positive, the opportunities. I mean, I'm hoping that it will increase and raise awareness among the private sector actors, since they are interested in being part of gender equality conversations and development conversations generally. So I'm hoping that them being involved in this process, it will raise their awareness of what we really do mean by women's rights, what we really do mean by women's empowerment, because we have seen these terms being co-opted and completely taken a different direction from what we do mean and what Beijing platform actually meant for women's empowerment. And so probably raising awareness and I hope that the private sector actors will be open to listening and to learning, and to listening to those that have been doing this work for so many years, and those are mainly women's rights organizations and movements and feminist activists and women human rights defenders. So I really hope that private sector actors in this process will be willing to listen and to learn. And probably then that will mean that they will do business differently, even within their own companies, in terms of how employment happens, in terms of the safe environment for women that work in those companies, because women continue to work for these companies. And so if they can learn one thing or two that can inform their internal practices, I do think that will be a positive thing for advancing women's rights. I think in terms of risk, it's what we have always said as feminists, as activists, in terms of knowing that, of course, private sector, the main objective of private sector is to make profits, and they might come as development actors, but we know that at the end of it all, they will do what they need to do to make profits. And the well-being, the advancement of gender equality, and well-being of women is not their first priority in terms of how they act. And so they were being part of this process and actually having almost unequal say on issues, women's rights and gender equality, causes a risk of almost deprioritizing the women's rights, and I think it can be dangerous.
Very much for those candid remarks, Dina. And Silke, thoughts from you?
Yes, I mean, I don't have that much to add. I mean, I think the most of, what your questions pointed at has been said. To add on the first question, I mean, I think global macroeconomic policy coordination has generally been difficult and to maintain on the agenda. It's not for a lack of proposals. We had the Stiglitz Commission after the financial crisis with lots of proposals that, could have been taken forward and that were chosen by member states not to take forward. And because of that general reluctance to deal with these issues, it's also been difficult to bring them into the gender discussions. But I think there's also still, at least in my experience, And it may be a pretext, it may be an excuse, but very often we still continue to hear, well, you know, these policies are bad for everyone. Why do they matter for gender equality? You know, we're asked to be, you know, really, really explicit about how austerity, you know, affects women in particular and show the evidence for that, etc. So there's also a bit of a dynamic going on to kind of say, well, you know, let's leave this out because really, you know, it's so broad and it doesn't really matter for gender equality all that much. So, I mean, that's just a continued struggle, and I think one that's really important for feminist organizations, but also feminist researchers, etc., to keep on producing that evidence and to keep on putting that evidence into the political and policymaking sphere in a very compelling and convincing way. On the potential risks of the private sector dictating the agenda, which are your words, I think the most important thing is to not let that happen. And that refers also to one of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat by Bernadette. These action coalitions are supposed to be co-led equally between these different stakeholders. And so that's why I think it's really important for other forces to be there and make sure that not one single actor dictates the agenda. I do see the risk of, you know, private sector commitments being under these action coalitions being quite vague, difficult to follow up, falling mainly into interest areas that they're already working on and that they're benefiting from. But I also see the opportunity because of this constellation to push them further. And I think two things that are really important. I think one thing I would like to see are really concrete commitments in terms of what's in the Beijing platform. So, you know, in my wildest dreams, I think of some of these multinational companies to committing to providing social protection and care services across their whole value chains, and then actually monitoring that this happens. It might be pie in the sky, but I think it's worth, you know, putting it there to kind of say we really want to make a difference. Like, we don't just want to, you know, do things that we're already doing. And then the second related point is to, and that's also something that I understand this leadership structure of each action coalition will think about, to think about a monitoring, reporting, and accountability structure for that of some sort that doesn't rely only on self-reporting. And I think that also speaks to the different roles that different partners in these coalitions can have, where obviously civil society, I mean, I think it is hoped that governments in the private sector will put financing into making some of the actions that are part of each action coalition, you know, being able to make progress and implement them. That is not an expectation from civil society, obviously. So what is the role of civil society? And I think, you know, in terms of, apart from setting the agenda and defining the actions, it's also, you know, a watchdog and monitoring and accountability role that should be pushed for as part of these action coalitions. But just to say, all of that is still, you know, and that's a risk and an opportunity. All of that is still being discussed and defined, and I think it's really important to be there early on to make sure that the right structures are in place.
Thank you very much, Silke, and for all of your contributions as well. And I think hopefully, Bernadette, one of the questions that was asked in the chat from Bernadette Crawford was regarding the Generation Equality Forum and the structure of it, specifically that I think Bernadette had the sense that the leads would be governments who would engage with civil society and the private sector, but the structure is a little bit different. So as far as CSOs engaging in that, I mean, as far as we're aware at this point, there is an opportunity for civil society organizations to co-lead these action coalitions with governments and the private sector. I personally don't know about what the formal process is to put yourself forward as a civil society actor to lead those coalitions, but I very much suspect that the core group for, or the convening group for the Generation Equality Forum are the ones that would dictate that process. So my initial thought would be, in response to Bernadette's question about the structure, is to certainly look at the UN Women website for the Generation Equality Forum section, and specifically what chances, what specific entry points there might be. But Silke, you might have some very specific instructions on that front.
I can just share the information that I have so far. So from what I know, the prospective leaders of these action coalitions, or those who have an interest in leading on a specific theme, are supposed to put their interest forward in a formal letter to UN Women by 21st February. And one of the asks of the member states and private sector and civil society partners is that the commitment to participate in this process is really at the highest level. So in terms of the civil society organizations, it would be at the leadership level, whatever executive director or level, to participate in these discussions. It would be whatever at the CEO level for the private sector, and presidential ministerial level, at least for the member states. So, and there are a few other kind of criteria that the leaders should fulfill. I think they're now available on the UN Women website. But just to say, the timeline that has been given now is actually quite tight. And it may get extended, but I don't know that yet.
Thank you very much, Silke. So I hope that answered your question, Bernadette, about the specific instructions. And as Silke said, the timeline is very tight because the deadline then is only in about 10 days' time. So it's definitely worth investigating that further if you are part of a civil society organization that's looking to lead an action coalition. So if we go to some of the questions in the chat, so we've got a question here from Sini Hakila. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So she asks, what countries have done particularly well in terms of addressing the negative gendered impact of macroeconomic policies through policy legislation? Obviously, Nordic countries have done relatively well, but I'd be keen to hear about other countries. So do we have any specific examples of really good cases, whether it be on unpaid care work, decent work, issues on social protection, where countries have done particularly well? So maybe if you can give some of your thoughts on that. And then if we roll these questions together, the second question that we've got here, which is from Yonda Fresnillo, who asks, does the Beijing +25 report reflect on the gender impacts of debt crises on the capacity of governments to implement the platform for action? And the role of international financial institutions like the IMF pushing austerity measures, privatization, and other gender-blind policy in the face of debt distress. So is there any linking to some of the policy prescriptions that we see coming from international financial institutions? So if you answer those two questions first, if I can ask you just for 2 minutes each to answer those, and then we've got a final question as well, which I think is more directed towards Liz. So who would like to kick off on one of those two or both of those questions? Anyone?
I can say something. So I think in terms of good practices on some of these things, the Secretary General's report is quite limited in that regard, because we're trying to avoid specific country references to specific countries as much as possible, just because if you start to reference one or two, everybody else will want to be referenced, especially since the report is drawing on the national reports. But some of the kind of positive developments we've pointed to and policies we've pointed to in some of the other more institutional reports that we do at UN Women, like the 2015 Progress of the World's Women, which had a whole chapter on gender responsive macroeconomic policies, including monetary policies and financing. It's a bit dated. now, but there were positive examples in terms of financing and different pathways for financing gender equality in there. There's also a recent UN Women ILO publication on financing for social protection, which includes a range of strategies that that can be used in order to raise revenue and allocate it in a way that is broadly redistributive and progressive along the lines that the report calls for. In terms of unpaid care, we've already back in 2015, but I think that continues and has gained momentum since then. In Latin America, there has been kind of a trend building on the Uruguayan experience of the national care system to look at how care can be addressed through both social protection, labor market policies, social services, etc., much more holistically. And that experience has gained a lot of interest and traction, with other countries kind of wanting to also develop similarly systematic approaches, and both the Economic Commission for Latin America and UN Women and other actors are trying to kind of support that going forward. So those are just two things I can mention. Obviously, also that's a region that the countries that made a lot of progress on care services did so during a period where the macroeconomic environment was much better than it is now. And some of the countries that made some progress during, before, let's say, the economic crisis, before 2009, 2010, like Ecuador, have now run into, the fiscal limitations that the end of the commodity boom and the crisis, et cetera, have generated. So that continues to be an issue. The report does refer also to the problem of debt. It is not as explicit as another report could probably be on the role of IFIs. I mean, that's the IFIs are also part of the UN family, but I think there is a lot of material in the report that kind of looks at the policies that are really harmful in this regard. It's not a report that names or shames neither member states nor other organizations.
Thank you, Silke. So Liz and Dina, Liz, also from your experiences of working on tax justice concerns, are there any particular countries that you can point to that have done particularly well in addressing the negative gendered impacts of macroeconomic policies, specifically on tax? So looking at legislation or otherwise, are there any that you can pinpoint or give a top line shout out to?
Well, there are. I actually was going to mention Uruguay as one, and it's kind of it's interesting from a tax justice point of view, because Uruguay is one of a handful of countries who has done quite a bit more to improve its tax and financial transparency policies and laws, and but it's not kind of it's not at the kind of pinnacle, if you like, of doing that, but it has made some real progress and been quite progressive in that sense. And it is financial secrecy as well that has such a big importance in terms of enabling governments to have progressive policies around gender equality, because financial secrecy is basically kind of distorting the opportunities for macroeconomic policy, because there's a kind of loss of state power as that power is actually drawn away by wealth, if you like, and multinational companies and through financialization, which I mentioned. So Uruguay's, I think, is interesting, and I know other countries are looking at that system. I don't know how. I haven't looked at it in enough detail, but obviously it had to be able to develop that plan. It had quite a significant loan, so I don't know what, it's going back to kind of almost what the Beijing platform says about, integrated policy. If it has a progressive kind of a health plan, it's taken a significant loan. What is the cost of taking that loan in other elements of the of social and economic policies for Uruguay? So I haven't got all the answers there, but I'm kind of curious to see how that unfolds, really. I mean, I think it's interesting that I think Kenya has introduced some very progressive transparency and tax laws recently. I'm not sure how that again comes back to integrated and political thinking. How does that impact on gender equality? Because clearly that progressive and tax laws and financial transparency are going to make a real difference in terms of domestic resource mobilization. But then it's kind of who it impacts and what's the analysis around that.
Thank you, Liz. And Dina, any reflections from you?
Yeah. I think in terms of countries, I can mention one that is in the GAD network paper, which is Rwanda, around unpaid care work, and the fact that they are conducting labor participation surveys to determine the women's unpaid care work. But also in the same country, we know that there is a lot of commitment for women participation in decision making, and that includes also within the sectors and areas of economic policies. And also the Rwanda really has progressive policies on equal rights to inheritance and ownership of land. So something progressive there happening. Ethiopia, really most progressive on land rights for equal rights of women and men to own and control land. So again, I think that's something to celebrate. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Dina. Yes, I think that there are quite a few examples. They're few and far between, unfortunately, as far as some really great examples to pinpoint to. And a lot of it coming from Latin America as well, leading the charge there on some progressive measures that are being taken in response to the negative effects, or recognizing the negative effects of certain macroeconomic policy decisions. And certainly you see in countries like Chile, back even from as far as 2008, where you have spending on childcare being increased as well, similar moves being made in Mexico too, and Uruguay as well is a really, really brilliant example, where you actually have women's rights activists and feminist alliances working to push legislators to approve or get governments to approve for a national care system in 2011, and really recognizing the importance of unpaid care work and the discrimination that women face in that regard. So thank you very much for those questions, everyone. There is a final question on here, which was by Anja Benning, who mentioned or asked if there are any existing materials for schools on tax justice and the role of macroeconomics for gender equality. And they've highlighted that they think it's an essential part or an essential component in early ages to understand and discuss these topics. And Anja, I think if you're still here, there is certainly some introductory materials that are around on linking tax justice and women's rights concerns. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice, if you have a quick search on Google, you'll be able to find them, has a brilliant working group on tax and gender, which and collectively with other organizations as well does produce outputs linking macroeconomic, specifically tax and gender justice concerns. So that's a really brilliant place to start. And there's a great resource as well on their site, including references to other organizations who are also doing all of this work. So definitely worth checking that out. So we're going to wrap up and close now. We've come to the end of the webinar. So thank you all of you for joining, and an absolute massive thank you as well to our three speakers for your time and your brilliant contributions and insights that you've provided. Also a massive thank you to Samantha Strabel, who's Gavin's coordinator, who's working ferociously behind the scenes. You haven't seen her, but thank you very much to her as well. And as I mentioned previously, the webinar is being recorded. So we hope to have it on the Gavin website shortly, but you will all also receive an email automatically after this webinar has ended with a link to a live playback. And please also don't forget to check out our latest briefing, as I mentioned, which is now on our website, which is Macroeconomic Policy and the Beijing +25 process. So thank you all very much and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Take care. Bye.